Morning, Nazir, and thank you for this opportunity. I really want to echo what you've just said in your introduction, that crisis really has the potential of bringing out both the worst and the best in us. Um, we all know from experience that ethics can put companies out of business. We have just too many recent examples of where unethical behavior led to the failure of companies. But in a similar manner, we also are quite aware that for many companies, it is the ethical culture that gives them a competitive advantage and that contributes to their longevity and their sustainability and success. But we can think in an instrumental way about ethics and say ethics can help us to uh, outperform our competitors or to build trust in our stakeholders, both our staff and also our suppliers and our customers. But I think it's very important to also understand that we should not only think instrumentally about ethics, what ethics can do for us. It's also a matter that we all have ethical duties. As human beings, we have ethical duties towards other people. And even in times of crisis, that still remains. It's not a case that we are now in crisis, so now we can say, well, sorry, this is survival now. And in survival, what matters is bread first, morals later. No, we can't do that. And I think it is very important to maintain our ethical standards in the middle of this crisis and also through this crisis, because how we act now is a big test for our character and also a big test for how we eventually will come out on the other side of this crisis. Now, in terms of our session this morning, and please put on my first slide, um, which is what we will discuss this morning. And we will first start just with a little bit of introduction to say something about ethics in general and ethical dilemmas. But then I want to go on to the real meat of this session, which is about ethical leadership in the time of crisis. And I'm going to look first of all at what is my personal role when it comes to ethics as a leader, and then move on to my role as an organizational leader. And I want to look specifically first at ethical leadership in the current period of lockdown, and then move on to also look at it post lockdown. So let's move on to slide 3, where I want to say something about ethics. How do we understand ethics? Probably that is the question that I get most in all the presentations that I do. So, what do you mean when you talk about ethics? Well, I use a fairly simple definition of ethics, which I believe is simple but sufficient, that says ethics is about the triangle of the self, the good, and the other. That means that you are ethical when you don't only consider what is good for yourself, but you balance that with what is good for others. So ethics is always has to do with how I treat other people in a manner that is not only good for them, but also good for myself. So it's finding that balance between the two. Now, there is something that is called the golden rule, and the golden rule also uh, revolves around these three concepts, because the golden rule, and we find a version of that across the globe in all cultures, in all religions, there's some version of this golden rule that says, always do good unto others as you expect others to do good unto yourself. So you can see the self, the good, and the other returns there. But what we are talking about here today is not only my personal ethics. Yes, we will also talk about that. But when we talk about leadership in the time of crisis, we also want to look at our role as leaders when it comes to the organizations that we lead. And therefore, I want us to look on the next slide to what do we mean by organizational ethics and not only personal ethics. Now, here on the screen, you can see the King 4 definition of of organizational ethics. It says that in the context of organizations, ethics refers to ethical values applied to decision making, conduct, and the relationship between the organization, its stakeholders, and the broader society. And it would be easy for you to see that the three core concepts around which we defined ethics, the good, the self, and the other, are to be found in this definition as well. Because when it talks about the ethical values of the organization, that is an indication of what the organization considers to be good, right, just, the decent thing to do. The self now becomes the organization, not the I, but the we. And it's about how we as an organization apply these ethical values when we make decisions, when we conduct ourselves, and when we find ourselves in relationships with stakeholders and the broader society. In other words, the other, again. So on this level, ethics seems to be fairly straightforward. And the question now is it that simple? And of course, we all know it isn't that simple. Very often we find ourselves in quite compromising situations. And on the next slide, I want to show you a classic difficult choice that people face from time to time. It's a little scenario that is used in cross-cultural studies on values and ethics. And it goes like this. It says, you are the only passenger and your friend is clearly speeding in an urban area. You call on your friend to slow down, but you are ignored. The next moment, the car hits an elderly person crossing the road with fatal consequences. Your friend now faces serious criminal charges. As the only witness to the event, the police ask you whether your friend was speeding at the time of the incident. And now the question is, what would you say? Would you admit and say, yes, officer, my friend was speeding? Would you go for, no, officer, my friend was definitely not speeding? Or would you go for the cop out and say, sorry, officer, I really have no clue? So all of a sudden, you can see it's not that easy. It is not that straightforward, because what we are experiencing here is a good old-fashioned ethical dilemma. And I want to say something about ethical dilemmas before we go into what does all of this mean for us. Now, on the next slide, you would see that when it comes to ethics, there are always three distinct categories. On the one hand, there are those things that we consider to be good, right, and just, the decent thing to do, the way we want people to behave. And there's a remarkable consensus in all organizations about these things. We share a lot of common convictions about what is good and right. But in a similar manner, on the right-hand side, in the red block, we say there are also clarity about a whole lot of things that we consider bad, wrong, unfair, things that we should not consider, like bribery and theft, things that we definitely don't want in our organizations. But then from time to time, we face dilemmas. And dilemmas is those situations where we no longer have the luxury of choosing between right and wrong, because choosing between right and wrong is not that difficult. What is more difficult is to act on that choice. But when we face dilemmas, we no longer have that luxury, because in the scenario that I gave you just now about the speeding, it is quite clear that here I have to choose between two good things. We both value honesty, and we also appreciate loyalty. So both honesty and loyalty are positive values for us. But in this situation, I'm forced to choose between them. If I go for option A, I'm honest, but I sacrifice my loyalty towards my friend. If I would have gone for either B or C, say, no, my friend was not speeding, or cop out and say, I really don't know, while you actually knew, then you are going for loyalty and it trumps honesty. So those are the type of dilemmas. And I think what we have already seen in this crisis of COVID-19 is that there are many of these dilemmas that play out on a daily basis. The first type of dilemma that we often see is when there are more patients than ventilators. And now doctors, health workers have to start making very tough choices. And on what are you going to base that choice? Will it be age? Will it be social position? Will it be gender? What will it be? And you can see you will always sacrifice something in making that choice. Or the other one that we've seen playing out over the last week, where there's simply not sufficient cash flow in a business to pay both employees and suppliers. And now all of a sudden you need to start weighing these things up. And it's exactly at this point where rule following behavior does not get us out of this. This is where we need to deep, where we need to go deep into our values and our convictions, dig deep there and come up with what we can morally justify as the best possible response. Okay, I just want to take one question quickly before we move on to the next one. And the question is here, how do we cope with decisions that are legal but not ethical? Is covering the legal aspects more important than ethics? Well, I believe that you can be legal but still unethical. And we have excellent examples in our own country. Nothing better than apartheid, that was a legal system, but definitely unethical. Or if you take the excellent example of our former and founding president, Nelson Mandela, who deliberately broke the law because he thought it was the right thing to do. So I think we should never rest assured and say, because something is legal, it is ethical. Because I am legally allowed to lay off my staff, I should do so. And I think that is also important why in the very first principle of King 4, it starts off by saying that we should act ethically beyond mere legal compliance. The ethics standard always are higher than the legal standard. And with that, I don't mean disobey the law. Very important to keep by the law, but we should never hide behind the law and says because this is legal, it is also ethical. Okay, let's move on to the next slide and the next session in my presentation, which deals with personal ethics. And here it is important that we first of all start looking at ourselves as leaders. As you have seen in that triangle of the self, the good, and the other, there's nothing wrong about looking at your own self-interest. The point is you should balance that with the interest of others. So being self-interested is not the same as being unethical, while being selfish is obviously being unethical. So a good starting point on the next slide is just to remind us that if we want to be ethical leaders, it always starts with us. And there's this very short 10 two-lettered word sentence that says, if it is to be, it is up to me. And we should remind ourselves in these times that the challenge for ethical leadership always starts with me. If it is to be, it is up to me. Now, there are a few dimensions, 3 that I would like to pick up on in terms of this first aspect of my personal ethics. And on the next slide, we say that the first thing that you need to do in this situation is to look after yourself. It is very important that you look after yourself, that you sanitize, that you make sure that you are in good health, because you are needed. And don't be foolish, don't do funny things that can sacrifice your own health and safety at this point. It is so important. Alistair McIntyre, the famous philosopher, reminded us when he said, self-sacrifice is as much a vice as selfishness. Then the second thing that is very important is that we should always try to be an example to others. It is important for us to walk the talk. If we say social distancing, personal hygiene is important, it is crucial, it is imperative that we should display exactly that we should walk that talk, that we should practice what we preach. And then probably one of the most fundamental ethical principles is never make an exception of yourself. If you believe something is right, it's right for everyone, and there's no way whatsoever that you can make an exception of yourself. I'm thinking of examples, people in this time walking their dogs while all the rest of us are expected to stay in our homes, or going for a run in my neighborhood while the rest of us are expected to stay at home. But always ask yourself, what will happen if everyone else starts doing what I'm doing at the moment? It will be chaos. The example of Trump also comes to mind when he spoke recently about wearing face masks, and he said it's recommended that people do it, but I'm not going to do that. That is to really make your own message ridiculous. Then always follow the golden rule in these times. In other words, treat others as you want to be treated. And especially for leaders in this time, treat others with the respect that you want to be respected with. Then the third important category is that we should show care and compassion. But here I talk not about our organizations. I want to refer specifically to us as individuals, that in our personal capacity, we should also contribute. We know about many people in need who won't be able to survive this crisis on their own unless they are being helped with food and shelter and the other basic necessities of life. And we've seen billions being contributed to the Solidarity Fund by the Oppenheimers, the Motsepes, the Ruperts, and so on. But we've also seen smaller companies and individuals in their personal capacity contributing not millions, but thousands and hundreds of rands. One specific initiative that we as the Ethics Institute have also joined in this time is an initiative that was launched by the Institute for Risk Management in South Africa, where as part of their risk management, they realized that the health crisis that we currently experience is already starting to flow over in an economic crisis, but eventually the biggest risk is that it can flow over in a social crisis where people become desperate because they are hungry and therefore might start doing things that we almost can't even don't want to contemplate. And they decided to call on their members to make donations to a project called Food Forward, who already, as we speak, are providing 20 million meals per day. And we want to assist them to be able to do more, especially now that many people are out of jobs and don't have income. And we've joined them, and so has the Institute of Directors and the Actuarial Society of South Africa, and a whole lot of others. Okay, but that is now ethics in our personal capacity. And I now want to move on to ethics in the lockdown, but specifically as leaders, as organizational leaders. What does organizational ethical leadership mean in this 21 days of lockdown, or however long it might still last? Well, I think the first one there on the next slide is that we need to restore a sense of community. We need to be aware that working from home can be lonely and it can be disrupting. And it is very important that we need to understand that this can cause anxiety, and therefore we need to use the technology and the means to our disposal to try and still maintain a sense of community even amidst this isolation. And obviously, leaders can't do it on our own, but it's something that we can easily distribute by establishing a network where we make sure that literally every person in your company is being checked into once a day. Just a phone call, and you can make it in small groups that are responsible for one another. But I think we do have a moral duty to maintain the sense of community and to fight against isolation and all the negative aspects thereof. Then I think what is secondly very important is that we should avoid at all costs falling into the trap of saying, okay, this is now survival, bread first, morals later. To the contrary, I think it is a good time, exactly where we are in lockdown, to go back and consolidate our fundamental and foundational values. That we go back and say, what are the values that brought we to where we were before the crisis? Because it's most probably those same values that are going to carry you through the crisis and that will eventually help you to recover from this crisis. So rather than wasting this opportunity and saying this is not a time for values and ethics, I would say if ever there was a time for values and ethics, the time is now. Thirdly, I think it is very important for us to take special care of the most vulnerable, both inside and outside our organizations. We know some people have deep pockets and they can survive this crisis for a long time because that is what wealth does to you. Wealth gives you the resilience to deal with crises. But people with shallow pockets or almost no pockets aren't that fortunate. And therefore, I think it is important in this time to not only look at your shareholders, but also to look at your own staff and to look at the lower levels of your staff where pockets aren't that deep. And especially when it comes to your suppliers as well, to have a special eye out for your SME suppliers. We know we can squeeze them now because they are suffering. But I think important to resist that urge and to make sure that you support them because ultimately it is these people inside and outside your organization that you desperately need to recover from this crisis. And then the fourth thing that I would recommend while we are still in lockdown is to create a vision of life beyond this pandemic and beyond lockdown. As leaders, we have very special obligations to create hope for people, to create meaning, to create purpose for people. There's an interesting study, you can see I marked it there at the bottom of the slide by Scott Berinato from an article that he recently published in the Harvard Business Review with the title, That Discomfort You Are Feeling is Grief. He did very interesting work on grief, but he said that we are all experiencing some form of loss. For us, some people already lost their jobs. Some people lost their entire income or part of their income. But there's also the anticipation of loss that still might come in the future. And that, of course, leads to anxiety, it leads to negative emotions. And we should not in any way deny that these emotions are there. We should recognize them, admit them. But for us as leaders, I think it is important to create a vision of there is life beyond this pandemic. There's also life in this pandemic. There is meaning to be found in this pandemic, and there's meaning to be found beyond it. And to keep that vision alive is absolutely essential. Okay, I will come to the questions in a moment. I just want to go to the final aspect of my presentation, which is organizational leadership post the lockdown. And there are also, on the next slide, four important things that I think we should attend to. Once we come out of this lockdown, we are back in our workplaces. Hopefully, we move beyond the pandemic. I think we all realize that we will need a very special effort to recover. We will have to be exceptionally good at what we are doing in order to rebuild our organizations to where they were before this crisis. And therefore, I think it is crucial that we invest in the morale of our staff. It was found in a number of studies that possibly the biggest factor on your performance and productivity is the morale of your staff. In other words, are they dedicated? Are they loyal? Are they willing to walk the extra mile for you? But now we also know that there's a direct link between ethics and staff morale, or if you want to, between morality and morale. And staff morale is boosted if people are treated in an ethical manner. In other words, we get the best out of people if we treat them in a respectful and fair manner, if we are honest with them. There's nothing that breaks morale like unethical behavior. It was actually found in a recent study that the biggest damage that a corruption scandal could possibly do to a company is that it devastates staff morale, that ultimately then impacts on productivity and profitability in the end. So that's the first ethical obligation for us, to invest in the morale of our people. Then trust. We all know that typically in times of crisis, trust is under a lot of pressure. And probably people are going to lose trust in institutions, in organizations, in their colleagues, in their leadership. And therefore, it is crucial that we focus on rebuilding that trust. Now, when it comes to trust, it is one of those things. You can't force another person to trust you. You can't regulate trust. The only thing that you can do is to act in ways that makes it easier for other people to trust you. In other words, you can work on your own trustworthiness. And here we find some interesting findings. Some of you might be familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer that is published every year at the World Economic Forum in Davos. If you go to the 2020 version of that Edelman Trust Barometer, they tell about a study that they've done about 40 multinational companies globally, where they try to understand why do people trust them. And they found two big factors why people trust companies. And those are competency and ethics. And then they tried to say, but which matters most? And they found that 76% of what they call your trust capital relates to your ethical behavior, and the remaining 24% to competence. So I think there's a big lesson for us. If trust has been dented in us as organization and in us as leaders, we need to restore that trust, and we need two things, but also in that specific order. We need ethical behavior by our leaders, by all our staff, and we need competence. And it's the combination of these two things that lead to trust. Then I'm going to wrap up with just the final 2 points. The first one is that we should avoid, once again, getting stuck in a survival mentality. One where we said, bread first, morals later. This is tough times. It's about the survival of the fittest. Nice guys come second. It's dark. All that matters in business is the bottom line. You know all these slogans that we often hear in business. It is very important to protect us against that, because the moment that we get stuck in such a survival or emergency ethic, then we really start narrowing our possibilities. There's an interesting study, and I refer to that at the bottom of the slide, if you can just put it up again, a study by Barbara Fredrickson that she calls the broaden and build theory, where they found that if you get stuck in this negative mentality of survival, your range of possibilities become very narrow. While if you can enable to envision beyond survival and start looking at new opportunities, you evoke a whole lot of other positive emotions, And that ultimately is what we need to energize people so that they can think wider and have broader perspectives, because you're going to need that in order to grow yourself back into your old shape. And most probably, if we are lucky, beyond that. The final thing that I would like to focus on is that I think we should, as they say, never waste a good crisis. And that is all about um, realizing that we were caught on the wrong foot with this one. We did not anticipate this sufficiently. And we all know now that there might be a whole lot of more of these crises in the forms of other viruses, pandemics. But we also know, looking at what happened at the World Economic Forum this time, that 5 of the top risks going forward are climate related. And we need to prepare ourselves for that as well. And I think one of the moral obligations that we have as leaders is to make sure that we are ready for a next crisis, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a climate shock that might come our way. We need to be ready, because as leaders, we need to protect our organizations. We need to make sure that we have the reserves, that we are resilient to deal with these things. Because when an organization goes out of business, it has such a detrimental knock-on effect on so many other people, as we can see. So to conclude, I think it is important that in this time of crisis, we should not suspend ethics. To the contrary, we should deepen our commitment to doing the right thing. And on the last slide, can I just share with you a little piece of wisdom that says, there's never a wrong time to do right. The time that we live in, there's a lot of things wrong, but exactly because there's such a lot of things wrong, it is the time for us to do the right thing. And as I said right at the beginning, crises have the potential to bring out both the worst, but also the best in human beings. And I think as leaders, we have an obligation to make sure that it is not the former, but the latter, but that we bring the best out of our people. Okay, I see there's quite a number of questions that came in. I'll take them in no specific order. First of all, can ethics be taught? What can institutes do besides communication and codes of conduct? Well, it's a good and a very important question. And I always say, yes, it can be taught. It just depends on what you want to. Now, the easy thing is to teach ethical standards, but only in a cognitive, intellectual manner. You can put your code of ethics, your code of conduct up. You can ask people to study it, you can assess them, and they can pass. So have you taught something? Yes, you've taught them intellectual ethical standards. Does that mean that they would behave in a different manner? Well, we hope so, but there's no guarantee. In other words, if we want to change the conduct, the behavior of people, that is a much more difficult assignment, but it can be done. But here you need to start working not only with the intellect of persons, but you need to start working with their values. You need to start working with their experience. You have to involve the whole person and not only their minds. And there are ways and means of doing it. And this mostly happens in smaller groups, or by exposing them to inspirational leaders, people who made a difference, so that ultimately what you want for behavior to change is that you really want the convictions and the values of people to change. It can be done, but it's much tougher than to just learn people on the intellectual level certain things about ethics. There's also a third thing that can be taught, and as the Ethics Institute, we are very involved in that, and that is managing ethics in organizations. Ethics can't manage itself, like strategy or finance or whatever other functional element of your business or organization you want to look at. You need to capacitate people, give them the capacity to manage ethics in organizations. And that is another skill that can be taught. What does it mean to manage ethics, but also to govern ethics? We now sit with mandatory social and ethics committees in terms of our Companies Act, and these people need to govern ethics. And if we look at Principle 2 of King, that says the governing body should govern the ethics of the organization in a way that supports the establishment of an ethical culture. Do these people know how you make cultural interventions, how you monitor, how you measure culture? All of these things can be taught, but of course you need to be very specific and very deliberate about that. Then let's take a next question. Do you think that corruption will increase or decrease during this crisis? Well, we don't have to wait very long to see the answer on that. And this is why ethical leadership is so important. We've already seen more than 500 complaints about anti-competitive behavior being lodged with the Competition Commission. In other words, people are opportunistic. They are selfish. They exploit others. They inflate prices. It will happen. But there's never a blanket answer to these type of questions. It all depends on your ethical values and how you see your own role in this. And history and society will ultimately, I think, judge very, very hard on people who try to exploit this crisis by being involved in some such exploitive and unethical practices. So yes, if we don't attend to this, it will increase. If we create ethical organizational climates that talk about these things, that discourage this, and that makes heroes of people who, in a very ordinary way, succeeded in resisting these temptations, then we can prevent corruption from occurring. Human nature hasn't changed, and therefore it is important that we create environments, ethical cultures, in which we can ensure that people remain decent and not become more dubious at this time. Okay, I see there's a few other questions as well. Yeah, no, I think I've covered all of them. I was asked here on the side also, are there any good books that you can recommend? But my personal favorite is one that I came about one day at a book festival in Cambridge in the UK quite a number of years ago, but it still remains for me a very important guidebook because it works with the whole person. And the title of the book is Synchronicity. It is written by Jaworski, and it has the subtitle of An Inner Path to Leadership. Then I'm inspired by some very ancient readings, and the one that I always return to is Aristotle's Ethics. In that book, I really find the inspiration for becoming the type of person that we need. And what I find inspirational, and also by some of these successors who interpret that definition in our own time, like Alistair McIntyre, whom I quoted before, that they say to do the right thing, you don't need only the right rules. And we have become a society where people are so obsessed with policies and rules and legislation that we forget that if we want consistent ethical behavior, we need the right person. Because if you have an ethical person, that person most probably don't need a lot of rules, laws, and policies. And that is something that we severely neglect. And that is why in this time of crisis, the ethic of Aristotle, or what we call virtue ethics, where it's about developing certain characteristics that we call virtues, becomes so important. Because if I am a person with moral virtue, a person with moral character, it becomes almost instinctively for me to do the right thing. What we often say, it becomes possible to do the right thing even when nobody's watching, because this has become second nature. And of course, this is the big challenge that we all have as leaders, that we don't only follow fear-based compliance approaches where people only do the right thing as long as somebody's watching, but where people do the right thing out of conviction because it has become second nature. It has become part of their character.